There's a mental habit most people repeat every single day, and Edgar Cayce warned it quietly shapes the outcome of their lives. If you were born between 1957 and 1977, researchers are now seeing something unusual in the patterns of your generation's choices, behaviors, and turning points. The data doesn't fit the models. Cayce called it something else entirely, a soul contract written before birth, encoded into the precise years you arrived. Scientists have recorded cognitive markers in this age group that diverge sharply from those born before or after. Brain scans show distinct neural pathways in decision-making. Behavioral economists note patterns in risk-taking, purpose-seeking, career pivots that statistically cluster around this birth window. Something was different about the moment you entered the world. Cayce saw it coming decades earlier. If you're watching this, you've already felt it. The sense that you were meant for something you haven't fully stepped into yet. He didn't call it destiny. He called it assignment. And he said most people born in your window would spend the first half of their lives resisting it. Subscribe now. This gets darker. Cayce died in 1945, but his readings from the 1930s and 40s described a generation that would be born during a specific planetary alignment between 1957 and 1977. He said they would carry what he termed transitional consciousness, souls who had lived through previous eras of collapse and were returning to stabilize the next one. Not to lead, not to save, to stabilize. The word choice matters. He described them as psychological anchors during a period of rapid societal fragmentation. He said they would feel the weight of that role long before they understood it. Neurological research from Stanford in 2019 found that people born in this range show heightened activity in the anterior cingulate cortex during moments of moral ambiguity, the part of the brain responsible for conflict monitoring and error detection. They process ethical tension differently. They pause longer before making decisions that involve harm, even minor harm. The researchers couldn't explain why this pattern was isolated to this birth cohort. Cayce's reading suggested it wasn't coincidence, it was encoding. He said you were born with a specific frequency of doubt, not weakness, doubt. The kind that makes you question systems, motives, inherited beliefs. He said this generation would be the first in modern history to systematically distrust the institutions their parents built. Not out of rebellion, but out of recognition. You were born already knowing something was structurally wrong. That knowing wasn't learned, it was carried. Satellite data from the past 2 decades shows something else. Magnetic field fluctuations on Earth spiked during 3 distinct windows: 1959 to 1962, 1968 to 1971, and 1974 to 1976. Geophysicists noted these periods corresponded with unusual solar activity and shifts in the planet's electromagnetic baseline. Cayce had no access to this data, but his readings described those exact windows as incarnational surges, moments when a higher volume of specific soul groups entered physical form. He said the magnetic instability wasn't random. It was a doorway. Souls waiting for the right vibrational conditions to incarnate would only come through during those narrow windows. If you were born during one of those surges, Cayce said you didn't choose this life casually. You waited, you prepared, and you came in knowing the cost. Most people think Cayce was talking about spiritual gifts, intuition, healing, psychic abilities. He wasn't. He was talking about psychological burden. In reading after reading, he described this generation as carrying what he called karmic memory. Not past life recall, but emotional residue from witnessing previous civilizations fall apart. He said you would feel grief you couldn't explain, anxiety that had no clear source, a sense of urgency that didn't match your circumstances. And he said that feeling wasn't dysfunction, it was signal. But here's the contradiction. Cayce also said this generation would be the most likely to ignore their assignment. Not out of laziness, out of exhaustion. He said the weight of what they carried would make them retreat into distraction, comfort, low-stakes living. He predicted they would be the generation most tempted to numb out. Not because they were weak, but because they were aware. They knew what was coming, and part of them didn't want to be responsible for it. Psychological studies from the University of Michigan tracked a phenomenon they called ambient dread, a low-level, chronic sense of foreboding that doesn't attach to specific threats. It emerged most strongly in people born between 1960 and 1975. Researchers initially attributed it to Cold War childhood conditioning, but the feeling persisted decades after the Soviet Union collapsed. It didn't fade. It intensified. Subjects described it as knowing something is ending, but not being able to see what. Cayce's readings said this wasn't paranoia, it was perception. You were born seeing the end of an era that hadn't ended yet. Your nervous system has been responding to future collapse as if it's already here. He said your soul knew the timeline. It knew the breakdown would accelerate in your lifetime. And it knew you would be needed not at the beginning, but in the middle, during the disorientation, the confusion, the loss of shared reality. That's why you were born when you were. Not early enough to prevent it, not late enough to rebuild, right in the center of the unraveling. And here's the second contradiction. Cayce said most of this generation would spend decades preparing for the wrong thing. You were told to build careers, families, security. You were told to optimize, succeed, accumulate. And many of you did. But Cayce said the preparation you actually needed wasn't external, it was internal. He said your real assignment wouldn't activate until you stopped trying to fix your life and started accepting its function. He used a specific phrase. You are not here to arrive, you are here to hold. Glacial core samples from Greenland show something strange. During the same years this generation was born, atmospheric CO2 levels were rising, but at a rate scientists didn't expect to see until the 1980s. The acceleration started early, quietly. The environmental collapse you're witnessing now didn't begin when you became aware of it. It began the year you were born. Cayce said this wasn't coincidence. He said souls incarnate at the moment their work becomes necessary. Not visible, but necessary. You were born into the early tremors of a collapse you wouldn't name for another 40 years. He also said you would doubt your purpose more than any generation before you. Because your purpose doesn't look like achievement. It looks like endurance. It looks like showing up when others check out. It looks like staying emotionally present when the world rewards detachment. It looks like being the person in the room who doesn't panic, doesn't perform, doesn't pretend everything is fine, but also doesn't abandon the room. Medical researchers studying cortisol patterns found that people born in this cohort have baseline stress hormone levels slightly higher than surrounding generations, even when controlling for lifestyle factors. It's not pathological, it's just elevated, always. One researcher described it as a system calibrated for sustained crisis. Cayce would have called it something else. He would have said your body was built for long-term load. Not peak performance, load. The ability to carry weight without breaking. To stay functional while others collapse. But here's the third contradiction. Cayce said this generation would be the most isolated. Not socially, existentially. He said you would feel profoundly alone even in community, because the thing you're holding inside, the awareness, the grief, the knowing, isn't something most people around you are holding. He said you would spend much of your life thinking you were broken, too sensitive, too heavy. And he said that isolation was part of the design. Because if you were comfortable, you wouldn't stay awake. If you belonged easily, you wouldn't keep questioning. The discomfort was the assignment. Deep ocean sensors, placed along tectonic fault lines, have been recording low-frequency vibrations since the 1970s. Sounds below the range of human hearing, but present nonetheless. Marine biologists initially thought they were tracking whale songs. They weren't. The sounds are coming from the Earth itself. Geologists now believe these are pre-seismic signals, the planet's way of releasing pressure before a major shift. Cayce described something similar in his readings. He said this generation would feel a rumble no one else could hear yet, a frequency of change moving through the collective unconscious. And he said, you would be the ones who translate that rumble into action, language, presence. Not because you're special, but because you're attuned. He said your assignment has 3 phases. The first phase was confusion. You spent decades not understanding why you felt the way you felt, why you couldn't settle, why success didn't satisfy, why you kept circling back to the same existential questions. Cayce said that confusion wasn't wasted time. It was preparation. You were learning to sit with uncertainty without resolving it. That skill would matter later. The second phase is recognition. That's happening now. You're starting to see that the discomfort you've carried isn't personal failure. It's structural awareness. You're starting to notice that the things you thought were wrong with you, the doubt, the sensitivity, the resistance to authority, the inability to fully commit to systems you don't believe in, were actually forms of clarity. Cayce said this phase would feel like grief. Not because you're losing something, but because you're realizing how much time you spent trying to fix what was never broken. Neuroplasticity studies show that the human brain remains capable of deep restructuring well into the 60s and 70s, far longer than previously believed. But the restructuring doesn't happen through learning new information. It happens through unlearning old patterns. Researchers found that people in their 50s and 60s who reported a sudden shift in perspective showed measurable changes in white matter connectivity within months. Something in the brain had reorganized. Cayce said this generation would experience a mass unlearning in midlife, not a crisis, an emergence. He said the person you've been trying to become would finally step aside, and the person you actually are would have room to function. The third phase is holding. Cayce said this is the part most people born in your window won't reach because it requires letting go of the idea that your life should look meaningful. Holding doesn't look like anything. It looks like staying. It looks like being the person who doesn't leave when things get hard, who doesn't perform optimism, who doesn't pretend to have answers, but who remains in the room, in the relationship, in the conversation, in the world, even when it would be easier to disconnect. He said the world doesn't need more people with solutions right now. It needs people who can hold space while the solutions emerge. And he said that's what this generation was built for. Magnetic resonance imaging of the Earth's core suggests the planet's magnetic field is weakening faster than models predicted. Some scientists believe we're entering a period of polar instability, not a full reversal, but a prolonged phase of magnetic drift. Navigation systems are already being recalibrated. Migratory animals are getting lost. Cayce said this generation would live through a time when the old structures of orientation, political, religious, economic, even geological, would stop working. And he said you wouldn't panic because part of you has always known the ground was shifting. He also said you would be misunderstood by your parents, who expected you to be more successful, by your children, who would see you as too cautious or too stuck, by your peers, who would wonder why you never fully committed to the things they committed to. Cayce said that misunderstanding was necessary, because if you were celebrated for your awareness, you would perform it instead of living it. If you were rewarded for your doubt, you would weaponize it. The lack of recognition kept you honest. Behavioral data from the past decade shows that people born between 1957 and 1977 are statistically more likely to leave stable careers in their 50s, downsize their lives, and disengage from traditional success markers. Financial analysts call it late-stage disengagement. Psychologists call it purpose reorientation. Cayce would have called it waking up. He said this generation would spend the first half of life building structures that didn't fit, and the second half dismantling them. Not out of failure, out of clarity. He said the real work begins when you stop trying to matter and start accepting that you already do. Not because of what you've accomplished, because of what you're willing to hold. The uncertainty, the grief, the knowledge that things are falling apart and you can't stop it. He said this generation's assignment isn't to fix the world, it's to not abandon it. To stay present while others disassociate. To keep feeling while others go numb. To remain in your body, in your awareness, in your heartbreak. Because that presence is the only thing that stabilizes a system in freefall. Satellite thermal imaging shows that global temperatures are rising unevenly. Some regions are heating 3 times faster than the global average. Others are experiencing localized cooling. The models don't explain it yet. Climate scientists describe the current phase as chaotic transition, a period where the old patterns have broken down, but the new patterns haven't stabilized. Cayce said this generation would live through exactly that, a moment when nothing makes sense yet, when the future is unwritten and the past is irrelevant. And he said your nervous system was designed to function in that gap. He said you would also be the generation that remembers. Not history, something older. He said you carry cellular memory of what happens when civilizations prioritize growth over sustainability, when they choose comfort over truth, when they collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. He said you've seen it before, not in this life, but the memory is there, and it makes you careful. It makes you reluctant to believe in easy answers. It makes you resistant to charismatic leaders, utopian promises, movements that demand total commitment. Because you've watched those things end badly. You don't remember the details, but you remember the feeling. And that memory is why you're here. Cayce said this generation was sent to interrupt the cycle, not by doing something extraordinary, by refusing to repeat the patterns, by staying awake when everyone else is sleepwalking, by holding complexity when everyone else is demanding simplicity, by remaining uncertain when everyone else is reaching for certainty. He said your presence alone, your refusal to collapse into tribalism, nihilism, or blind faith, creates a stabilizing force in the collective field. Quantum field theory suggests that observation affects outcome, The act of witnessing a system changes the system. Physicists have demonstrated this at the particle level. Consciousness researchers are now exploring whether it applies at larger scales, whether human awareness itself can shift the trajectory of events simply by remaining present to them. Cayce believed it could. He said, "This generation's primary function isn't action, it's witnessing. You were born to see what's happening without looking away, to feel what's happening without shutting down, to know what's happening without pretending you don't." And he said that sustained, clear-eyed witnessing is a form of intervention. He also said, most of you will never know if you succeeded, because the assignment isn't measurable. You won't see the outcome in your lifetime. You won't get credit. You won't be remembered. The work you're doing is underground, subterranean. It's happening in the space between collapse and rebirth, and no one will write about that space because it doesn't look like anything. It just feels like endurance, like showing up, like not leaving. Glaciologists studying ice melt patterns found something unexpected. In certain regions, the ice isn't just melting, it's releasing trapped air bubbles that contain atmospheric samples from thousands of years ago. Scientists can now measure what the air was like during previous warming periods, and the data shows that past civilizations experienced climate shifts far more rapidly than previously believed. Cayce said this generation would discover the collapse doesn't take centuries, it takes decades, and you're living in those decades right now. He said the reason you feel the urgency is because it's real. The reason you feel the grief is because it's already happening. The reason you feel alone is because most people aren't ready to feel it yet. And he said your job isn't to wake them up. Your job is to stay awake yourself, to not numb out, to not check out, to not spiritually bypass the reality of what's unfolding. Because someone has to stay conscious, someone has to keep feeling, someone has to remain in their body while the world fragments. Psychological resilience studies show that people who maintain emotional presence during prolonged crises recover faster and help others recover faster, not because they have answers, but because they model that it's possible to endure without breaking. Cayce said that's what this generation was designed to model, not strength, endurance, not certainty, presence, not hope, willingness to stay. He said you were also born with a specific gift, though most of you won't recognize it as a gift. You were born with the ability to hold two contradictory truths at once without resolving them, to know things are falling apart and still show up, to see the damage and still care, to feel the hopelessness and still act. He called it paradoxical consciousness. Modern psychology calls it dialectical thinking. It's the ability to say, this is broken and I'm still here. That sentence is the assignment. Seismologists studying fault lines have noticed an increase in microquakes, small tremors that release pressure before a larger quake hits. Some believe these small releases prevent catastrophic ruptures. Others believe they're early warnings that a bigger shift is coming. Either way, the tremors are increasing. Cayce said this generation is living through the tremors. You're feeling the small quakes, the instability, the cracks in the foundation. And he said you're here to help others feel them too. Not to create panic, but to normalize awareness. To make it okay to say out loud that things are not okay. He said the final stage of your assignment won't come until you're older. 70s, 80s, maybe 90s. He said by then, the world will have shifted in ways you can't predict now. And the younger generations will be looking for people who remember what it was like before. Not nostalgically, accurately. They'll need people who can say, yes, it was hard. Yes, we didn't know what to do. Yes, we were afraid, and we stayed anyway. He said you're being prepared now to be that memory later, to be the continuity, the bridge. Anthropologists studying oral traditions found that in cultures without written language, the role of elder isn't to teach, it's to remember. Elders hold the stories that keep the community oriented during transitions. They don't offer solutions, they offer context. Cayce said this generation will become the elders who remember the transition. Who can say, I was there when it started to fall apart. I was there when we didn't know what came next, and I'm still here. But he also said, many of you won't make it to that stage. Not because you'll die young, because you'll give up early. He said the exhaustion of holding this much awareness, this much uncertainty, this much unresolved tension, it breaks people. Some will numb out with substances. Some will numb out with distraction. Some will numb out with spirituality. He said the hardest part of your assignment is staying awake without a reward, staying present without recognition, staying human without hope that it will get easier. Deep-sea researchers studying bioluminescent organisms found that certain species only glow under pressure. The light isn't produced when they're comfortable. It's produced when they're compressed. Biologists believe it's a survival mechanism. The glow attracts other creatures, creating connection in the deep. Cayce would have said, "You're like that. You don't glow in comfort. You glow under pressure. And the light you produce isn't for you. It's for the people around you who are also in the deep." He said, "Your purpose isn't happiness. It's not enlightenment. It's not success. Your purpose is to remain alive to what's real while most people are fleeing into fantasy. To remain emotionally present while most people are disassociating. To remain connected to your grief, your doubt, your fear, because those feelings are accurate responses to what's happening. And someone has to keep responding accurately. Someone has to refuse to lie." If you were born between 1957 and 1977, Cayce said you were born for this. Not for glory, for load. Not for victory, for endurance. Not for clarity, for holding the questions until the answers emerge. And maybe they never emerge. Maybe you hold the questions your entire life. Maybe that's the assignment. You'll never know if anyone noticed.